There's a great need for food production. There's also a great need for solar energy, but there's a limited amount of land. Do we use our land for solar energy or do we use it to grow food?
Look at any solar farm and you see the same thing. Endless rows of panels, dead ground underneath. Land that used to grow food now growing nothing but electricity. For decades, that was the deal. Every solar farm meant one less farm. Then engineers raised the panels, and underneath them, something started happening that was not supposed to be possible.
There is a solution.
Agrivoltaics can be a game changer.
Raspberries ripening, vegetables thriving, sheep grazing, the same hectare producing power and food at once. And in some cases, the crops growing better because of the panels, not in spite of them. This is how agrivoltaics turn solar farms into massive food-producing systems. The idea, everyone ignored. Here is the thing most people don't realize. This idea is not new. It was first proposed back in 1981 by two German scientists, Adolf Gerzberger and Armin Zastrow. Picture two researchers sketching out a concept so simple, it almost sounds like a trick. Instead of building solar farms that effectively erase farmland, you raise the panels and let crops grow directly beneath or between the rows. The same hectare produces electrons and food at the same time. They wrote it down. And then the world basically ignored it. For decades, that elegant theory just sat on paper, gathering dust, waiting for a moment when humanity would finally need it badly enough to build the thing. That moment is now, and the reason comes down to a brutal piece of land arithmetic. For most of the last 20 years, solar energy and agriculture have been locked in a quiet war over the exact same ground. In the United States alone, solar development could require more than 4 million hectares of land by 2050. And the U.S. Department of Energy estimates the figure could climb past 10 million hectares as the build-out accelerates. More than 80% of that land would potentially overlap with areas already used for agriculture. Every gigawatt of solar capacity has historically meant thousands of hectares of soil pulled straight out of food production. And it gets worse, because the planet is also losing nearly 24 billion tons of fertile soil every single year to erosion and a changing climate. So, a world that desperately needs more clean energy and more food has been forced to pick one. Agrivoltaics is the first serious attempt to refuse that choice. And honestly, the scale of what refusing it could unlock is hard to wrap your head around. According to the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, one of Europe's leading solar research organizations, combining the two uses on a single plot could improve overall land use efficiency by as much as 60 to 70% compared to building separate solar farms and separate fields. Sit with that for a second. Two parcels of land collapsed into one, with most of the productivity of both still intact. That one statistic is the entire promise of agrivoltaics. But to understand why it works at all, you first have to understand just how badly ordinary solar farms have been wasting the ground beneath them. Why solar farms devour land. Traditional solar farms began booming in the early 2000s as the great clean alternative to fossil fuels. And as they spread, one problem became impossible to hide. They eat land, an enormous amount of it. A large-scale solar farm in the United States typically requires around 4 to 5 hectares for every single megawatt of electricity it generates. That means 1 gigawatt-scale project can swallow more than 4,000 hectares, an area equivalent to thousands of football fields laid end to end. Multiply that across the build-out, the entire energy transition demands, and you start to feel the size of the problem. Here's why it happens. The waste is baked right into the design. To squeeze out maximum efficiency and keep costs down, conventional panels are mounted low to the ground, and the gaps between rows are kept tight. Those corridors are far too cramped for a tractor, a harvester, or any serious agricultural machinery to fit through. So, land that used to grow food becomes land that grows nothing but electricity. In the best case, you might get a little beekeeping out of it, or some sheep nibbling weeds. But bring in anything bigger, cattle or horses, and the risk of wrecking that expensive solar infrastructure climbs way too high. The land is not shared, it is simply taken. And that is the central conflict of the modern era, written right across the landscape. The world needs clean power. The world also needs the ground that feeds it. A standard solar farm makes you spend the same hectare twice and hands you only one return. Every megawatt installed that way is a quiet subtraction from the planet's ability to feed itself. For years, everyone accepted that trade-off as the unavoidable price of cleaning up the grid. Agrivoltaics is the argument that the price was never necessary in the first place. So, what does a system actually look like when it's built to break that rule? How agrivoltaics rewrites the rules. This is where everything changes. Unlike a traditional solar farm built to squeeze out the maximum number of kilowatt hours, an agrivoltaic system is engineered from the start to serve two masters at once, the harvest and the grid, and to make sure neither becomes a casualty of the other. You can see the difference the second you walk onto one of these sites. Many modern installations use bifacial solar panels that capture sunlight from above and reflected light bouncing off the ground below, lifting power generation efficiency by roughly 5 to 20% compared to conventional panels. In arid regions, some farms stand the panels up vertically, like long energy walls planted in the landscape. Those walls slow the wind, limit soil erosion, and shield the land from creeping desertification. Elsewhere, elevated systems lift the panels 3 to 5 meters off the ground, leaving so much clearance that tractors, seeders, and modern harvesters move freely underneath. The machinery that conventional solar farms locked out is suddenly welcome back in. But here's the part that really matters. The hardware is only half the story. What truly separates agrivoltaics from everything that came before is the control technology. Many systems now integrate artificial intelligence, weather sensors, and automated controllers that adjust the tilt of every panel in real time, constantly reading soil moisture, air temperature, sunlight intensity, and crop growth to optimize both the yield and the power output simultaneously. On a scorching afternoon, the system angles the panels to throw more shade and protect the plants. On a mild, overcast morning, it flattens them out to grab every last photon for the grid. These fields are not really farms anymore. They behave more like data-driven food and energy factories, where every degree of panel rotation is a decision weighed against the needs of the plants below. And the strangest thing of all is that this endless negotiation between shade and sunlight is not even a compromise. For a lot of crops, it makes them grow better. If breakdowns of the technology quietly rewriting how the world feeds and powers itself are worth your time, take a second to subscribe before we go further. Because the next part is where the science turns genuinely strange. The counterintuitive truth about sunlight. Now, here's the fact that makes this entire thing work, and I promise it is the opposite of what you'd expect. Crops do not always grow better with more sunlight. Every plant has a ceiling, a point scientists call the light saturation point. Push past it and the leaves simply cannot turn any more energy into growth. The extra light stops helping and starts actively hurting. It turns into heat, and heat turns into thermal stress, which drives up water evaporation and drags growth efficiency right back down. Under extreme conditions, a crop can lose up to 95% of the water it pulls from the soil just trying to cool itself off. The plant is spending everything it has on survival instead of on yield. That is exactly why lettuce, spinach, tomatoes, and soft fruits often grow better in partial shade than under a full, brutal day of direct sun. For those plants, a day of unbroken sunlight past a certain point isn't abundance, it's stress. So, the shade thrown by a solar panel isn't necessarily a penalty subtracted from the harvest. Under the right climate, at the right time of day, it is genuinely a gift the plant would choose for itself if it could. And for years, that was just a hypothesis on a chalkboard, until a team of researchers in southern Germany decided to drag it into the open air and find out whether it actually held up. The experiment that proved it. So, picture the scene. Near Lake Constance in the south of Germany, between 2016 and 2018, a research team from the Fraunhofer Institute is standing in a field running one of the most cited agrivoltaics trials ever conducted. The setup is almost stubbornly simple. Grow crops beneath solar arrays. Grow identical crops on conventional open farmland right next door. Then compare them, season by season, under whatever the weather happens to throw at them. No simulations, no projections, just the same plants grown two ways, measured against each other in real dirt. And in 2016, the result is bad. The season is cool and wet, and yields under the panels come in about 25% lower. The shade is costing the harvest, exactly the way every skeptic predicted. You can almost feel the mood in that field, the team standing there watching the elegant theory underperform right in front of them. If the experiment had ended right there, agrivoltaics might have been quietly written off as a clever idea that failed the moment it met reality. Then 2017 and 2018 happen. Europe gets slammed by brutal heat waves and crushing drought, and the entire picture inverts. The agrivoltaic plots, the ones that had been losing, suddenly outperform the open fields, protected by lower temperatures and far more stable soil moisture beneath the panels. That is the moment. The exact moment the shade flips from a 25% liability into a genuine advantage, right there in the data, in front of the people who built the trial. The thing that looked like a failure in a mild year became the thing that saved the crop in a harsh one. And that reversal is the signal that matters more with every year that passes. Global temperatures have already risen more than 1.1 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline, and severe heat waves keep arriving more often, not less. In that kind of world, the shade from a solar array stops looking like a tax on productivity. It starts looking like a climate control system bolted directly onto the farm, one that flips from liability to asset at the exact moment the weather turns against the crop. The hotter and drier it gets, the more that shade is worth. A research trial proves a point. The real question was whether anyone could turn that point into a working business. The raspberry farm that changed Europe's mind. Here's where the title stops being a promise and becomes a place you can actually drive to. That proof landed in the village of Baberich in the Netherlands, right up against the German border, where the fruit grower Groenleven teamed up with the energy company BayWa to build a 4-hectare raspberry farm fused directly with solar generation. 3 of those hectares were converted into a 2-megawatt agrivoltaic system, enough to power hundreds of homes while the raspberries kept growing underneath. This wasn't a research plot hidden behind a fence. This was a working commercial farm with real money on the line, and raspberries are about the most punishing test case you could pick. They bruise under hail, they shred in strong wind, they collapse under extreme heat, which is why growers normally drape them under plastic tunnels running for hundreds of meters across a field. In Baberich, the solar panels replaced that plastic roof entirely. The arrays were set in an east-west orientation to maximize power output, while doubling as massive wind barriers for the crop below. And the first attempt didn't work cleanly at all. The team started with conventional panels, and they smothered the plants, blocking too much light for the raspberries to thrive. So they redesigned. They swapped in a different panel with wider gaps between the photovoltaic cells, letting more sunlight slip through to the canopy underneath. That one engineering tweak was the entire difference between a failed pilot and a model worth copying across a continent. After that adjustment, the numbers genuinely turned heads in both the farming and the energy worlds. The quality and the yield of the sheltered raspberries did not drop at all. In several cases, they actually beat the conventionally grown fruit outright. The crop the panels were supposed to compromise came out ahead instead. Now, here's why everyone really paid attention. For a high-value soft fruit like raspberries, which sells for roughly $6 to $12 per kilogram across Europe and the United States, a single bad storm can wipe out hundreds of thousands of dollars in a couple of hours. And the decisive moment in Baberich wasn't a good harvest. It was a disaster. When violent summer storms tore through the region, the traditional plastic tunnels over the control fields were ripped apart by wind and hail, and some of those plots lost nearly their entire harvest in a single afternoon. The raspberries growing under the steel and glass of the solar array came through with almost no significant damage, sheltered by the very same panels that had been quietly generating revenue overhead the entire time. The structure that paid for itself in electricity also paid for itself in saved fruit, and the protection ran deeper than just the storm. Temperatures beneath the agrivoltaic canopy ran several degrees Celsius cooler, which made it a more bearable place to work and cut irrigation demand by up to 50% during dry stretches. With water prices and irrigation costs climbing sharply across Europe every year, halving your water bill is not some footnote on a spreadsheet. It is a structural advantage that compounds every single season. And here's the most elegant part. As the crops release moisture through evapotranspiration, they cool the air around the panels, and solar panels run more efficiently when they're cooler. The plants help the panels help the plants. Two systems that spent 2 decades fighting over the same resources start quietly feeding each other instead. And once you see the math work on a single farm, the next question is what it does to the farmer's bank account. 2. Incomes from 1 hectare. Because agrivoltaics doesn't just shield a crop from the weather, it rewires the entire economics of the land underneath it. A farmer is no longer selling only what grows. The surplus electricity from the array can be sold straight back into the grid. A second, steadier stream of money that keeps paying even in a year when extreme weather flattens the harvest completely. When the crop fails, the meter is still running. And that stability matters most, exactly where farming is most fragile. In the United States, more than half of all family farms generate less than $100,000 in annual revenue. And they're being squeezed from every direction by rising fuel costs, climbing fertilizer prices, and longer, deeper droughts. For a farm that close to the edge, a single bad year can be the end of the line. Even a modestly sized agrivoltaic installation can add tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in electricity income every year, depending on the region and local power prices. That second income doesn't just add money, it changes the entire risk profile of the operation. The deeper value is structural too. Agrivoltaics cuts carbon emissions, loosens the grip of fossil fuels, and hands rural communities a degree of energy independence they have genuinely never had before. The hectare stops being one nervous bet on the weather and becomes 2 bets that almost never fail at the same time. But the version spreading fastest right now isn't the high-tech one at all. It's almost absurdly simple, and it walks on 4 legs. The simplest version wins. Forget the AI controllers and the high-value berries for a second. The fastest growing model in all of agrivoltaics today runs on something far older and far dumber: sheep. Across the United States and Europe, a rising number of solar farms now graze sheep directly beneath the panel rows to control vegetation instead of running mowers or spraying chemical herbicides. According to the American Solar Grazing Association, tens of thousands of hectares of U.S. solar farms have already adopted the practice, and that figure climbs every single year. This isn't a forecast for some distant future. It's already happening at scale, right now. And the economics here are blunt and honestly kinda beautiful. A large solar farm can spend tens of thousands of dollars a year just keeping the grass down so it doesn't shade the lowest panels or turn into a fire hazard. Sheep do most of that work for almost nothing, and they generate their own income on the side through wool, milk, or meat. They're also weirdly perfect for the job, in a way bigger livestock just aren't. They're small enough that they won't damage panels or wiring, and the shade overhead actually reduces their heat stress through the worst of summer, so the animals are healthier for being there. Rows that used to produce only electricity become working pasture. In more and more places, this isn't a quirky magazine photo anymore. It's a settled business model, and it's the version of the solar farm as food system scaling faster than anything else, precisely because it asks for almost no new technology at all. And if it works on a few thousand hectares of American farmland, the obvious next question is, what happens when you scale this idea up to something the size of a desert? When a desert feeds itself. So let's push this logic as far as it can possibly go. China spent the early 21st century becoming the world's manufacturing core, producing nearly 30% of global industrial output. And it paid for that with coal. At one point, the country burned more than half the world's coal, and coal supplied as much as 70% of its electricity. By 2010, China was the planet's single largest carbon emitter, responsible for roughly 30% of global CO2 emissions, with major cities regularly buried under severe air pollution. Then, in 2020, it committed to carbon neutrality by 2060 and started building enormous renewable energy bases across its northern and western deserts, more than 200 of them, with a combined target capacity around 455 gigawatts. The flagship of all of it is rising in the Kubusi Desert, a structure already nicknamed the Great Solar Wall. And building a power plant in a desert sounds completely backward until you look at the conditions. The Kubuchi gets more than 3,000 hours of sunshine a year, with solar radiation among the highest anywhere in China, which lets the panels run at high efficiency for most of the year. It's also vast and almost entirely empty, with room for arrays stretching across hundreds of square kilometers. The exact harshness that makes that desert nearly useless for anything else is what makes it perfect for this. And here's the part that ties the whole story together. At a scale that absolutely dwarfs any raspberry farm, the same agrivoltaic principle shows up again. The panels across parts of the project are mounted 2 to 3 meters above the ground, and the shade they throw lets grass take hold in soil that should be completely barren. Flocks of sheep now graze between the rows in areas of the Kubuki and Inner Mongolia, controlling the vegetation, lowering the fire risk, and cutting maintenance costs across an installation far too large to manage any other way. Millions of panels overhead, herds of sheep below, in a place that grew next to nothing before any of this arrived. Land once written off as economically worthless is now doing 2 jobs at once. That is the solar farm turned food producing system, scaled all the way out to the horizon. And if it works in a desert at that size, the only real question left is why this isn't already everywhere. Why it hasn't taken over yet. Honestly, that question deserves a straight answer. Agrivoltaics runs into 3 walls, and none of them are small. The first is local opposition. A lot of communities just don't want large energy projects rising up near their homes. The same resistance that slowed wind farms and biogas plants across plenty of regions for years. There's also a real and pretty reasonable fear that some investors will use a thin layer of agriculture as cover, planting a token crop just to justify building what is functionally a conventional solar farm under a friendlier name. And once that suspicion takes root in a community, it is very hard to dig back out. The second wall is regulation. When one parcel of land grows crops and generates power at the same time, the rulebooks genuinely don't know what to call it. Is it farmland or industrial energy infrastructure? Who collects the agricultural subsidies tied to that soil? Who legally owns the array overhead? And who's on the hook when it needs repair, the farmer or the energy company? These aren't abstract debating points. They've stalled real projects for years before approval, while agencies argue over definitions written long before this technology existed. The third wall is cost. Agrivoltaic systems typically run about 10 to 20% more expensive per unit of electricity than ordinary solar because they demand taller support structures, more complex engineering, and a design that has to satisfy both the crop and the grid at the same time. And that is the genuine knife edge of this entire field. Lean the design too far toward power, and the plants below starve for light. Lean it too far toward the plants, and the energy output sags. Holding that balance is technically hard and financially expensive, and that single difficult is the biggest reason a technology with this much raw potential hasn't already exploded into the mainstream. The promise is real, so is the friction. The new face of the field. Even with all 3 of those walls still standing, agrivoltaics has already cracked open a future that looked impossible just a generation ago. A field that feeds people and powers the grid from the same soil, in the same season, under the same sun, at the same time. That trade-off everyone treated as a law of nature, energy or food, but never both, turns out to have been a design choice the entire time. In a century where land, fresh water, and clean energy are all getting scarcer and more valuable at the same time, a technology that delivers all 3 from a single hectare isn't a niche experiment for research institutes. It's a serious candidate for one of the defining solutions of the next 50 years. That strange sight, crops growing in the cool shade of solar panels, sheep grazing in the shadow of a desert energy wall, may not stay strange for long. Give it another generation, and it may simply become what a farm looks like. So, here's the question worth arguing about down in the comments. If agrivoltaics can genuinely produce food and electricity from the same land at the same time, why is your country still building solar farms and food farms as if they were enemies fighting over the last acre? Tell us where you land on it. And if you want the full story of the Great Solar Wall rising straight out of the Kubuki Desert, the engineering, the impossible scale, and the sheep, that is the one we are telling next.